insidious epidemic blindness and fear of death. Or the struggle of Lucifer and Ahriman for dominion of the human soul during the 2020 coronavirus epidemic. Part 2. 2020, a year of fear, selective riots and epidemic blindness. Summary of previous ones. In the previous section, we have sketched out some of the most important modern anthroposophical knowledge that can be used to understand the activities of haunting forces that are not idle even during the COVID-19 coronary epidemic. We must take the Lucifer and Ahriman deceptions in turn. It will be both painful and reassuring truths. I need to shed light on what specific signs there may be when one comes under the influence of Lucifer or Ahriman, that is, the opposing forces. More or less many may be familiar with what is described here. Our mistakes can always be traced back to the influence of opposing forces. If we are not strong enough spiritually and spiritually, we will not be able to maintain our balance, even in the realm of thinking, and their influence will necessarily manifest itself in mistakes, in the tilting of our spiritual balance. It is difficult to embrace the truths, for we must constantly do so in the opposition of Lucifer and Ahriman. Many times, both appear at the same time. However, if one falls in love with one's own mistakes, half-truths, or if one too easily embraces the misconceptions of others, especially if he has been doing so for months or years, which then seem to him to be true explanations, it is very difficult and painful to get rid of them when the time will come to face the truth. Therefore, one often cannot get rid of them, but invents other wrong arguments and explanations. He stays more than his beloved mistakes. He doesn't adjust to reality, but seeks explanations to support his favorite misconceptions. I experience this especially in the false theories of people with a materialistic feel. In fact, they ideologize their position, in a false way, so that they can still consider their favorite lies and mistakes to be true. In such cases, depending on the view, the conception of thought, Lucifer or Ahriman is so strongly present in the spiritual life of man that he is unable to get out of their influences that result in deception. He is unable to find the middle, the balance in terms of reality. Of course, if someone is under such influence in some area, the state of deception may not exist in many other ways. The deceived way of thinking usually covers only narrower or wider areas of life. I have no illusions that by embracing and accepting the facts described below, they will have the greatest difficulty for those who would need it most. Those who would be too painful to admit that they had been influenced or misled by misleading spiritual forces with their mistakes are looking for a way out of this situation in every way to stay with their beloved mistakes. Nor do I have any doubt that the Luciferian blindness, the Ahriman fewer, will lead some people to see the devil, and especially the Ahriman, the deceiver, described here. The beginnings of a new coronary epidemic. Let's take the facts, the events first. In China, at the end of 2019, a new disease was discovered that spread epidemically, that is, from person to person. It appeared all over the earth in a few months. It was soon discovered that this is spread on a physical level by a virus. As an anthroposophist, we are well aware that the virus is not the cause of anyone getting an infectious disease. It's no different. However, without the increased presence of the virus, the disease does not appear with its typical symptoms. Healing itself can only be started if the viruses have multiplied in the patient. The current state of the epidemic and Lucifer's attack to disregard the physical facts. The physical symptoms of the new disease are largely similar to those of other respiratory infectious diseases, but not completely. Doctors first in China and then in many countries around the world soon concluded, seeing the course and spread of the disease, that it would lead to the deaths of many more people if left to spread as freely as, say, the flu. By now, by December 2020, this has been clearly demonstrated in Hungary and many other countries. The saturation of hospitals with a relatively low COVID-19 morbidity rate is already much higher than it is with the similarly low incidence of influenza. This means that there are about 10 times more people in need of hospital care than roughly 10 times a week. At the same time, so many patients in Hungary have never been forced to ventilate at the same time as now. This is a huge difference from the flu, which can only be denied with luciferic blindness. The number of COVID-19 patients per 100,000 population is now around 1/10 of the number of patients at the peak of a moderate flu epidemic, while intensive care units and hospitals are already barely able to bear the burden of COVID-19 patients. This also means that the flu causes symptoms in far fewer people that require such a high rate of hospital care. Compared to the proportion of all flu, far fewer people develop a complication of the flu that would require intensive care, as is the case with COVID-19. This needs to be addressed at the outset, because one of the key points in adjusting to reality is whether or not one can attribute the death from COVID-19 to this disease. It is strange to describe such a sentence, but in the year 2020, horribly wild and blinded thoughts came to light, and some of them even became widely popular. The main characteristic of these was the denial and disregard of physical and material observations and facts. Manipulating numbers, under the influence of Ahriman, increases fear. It is part of the facts that the appearance, danger and spread of the disease were broadcast in the media hysterically and radiating uncertainty quite soon after the onset of the disease. The hysterical, sensational way of serving has definitely been a feature of the media for a few decades anyway. This is nothing new. Recently, all kinds of click-hunting sites have appeared on the internet, spreading countless rumors. I have seen with sadness that there are also a good number of anthroposophists who have fallen to these pages, false news, and distributed them uncontrollably on the World Wide Web without sufficient critical sense. As for our subject, the point is that this false serving was supported and inspired by both Luciferian and Ahriman beings. In this way, each was able to increase his influence, usually in separate groups of human souls. Ahriman managed to drag the masses of people stuck in material life even further into the dark world of matter, threatening death. Lucifer, on the other hand, managed to tear apart a multitude of people living with physical contempt, unnoticed, or open aversion to physical reality, and to incite hatred against those who disagreed with them. It is especially important to point out that the serving was primarily fueled by fears. If a disease that appears to be serious appears, it is not appropriate to pass on the related information in such a way that fear rises immediately. Even if they want to make the population better at the precautionary, social responsibility that is really needed at the time of an epidemic. It is mainly the incitement to fear that is more justified than justified. There were hardly any COVID-19 patients in Hungary in the spring, but the vast majority of people still thought they were in great danger. The feeling of fear is the realm of Ahriman. He planted this feeling, GEA 13, into the human being in the Atlantean age of Earth. So if the news aroused fear, it was primarily Ahriman who was behind it. He usually persuaded people to fear the virus, the disease, the death of themselves or their loved ones. Even if an epidemic seems serious, care must be taken not to cause undue fear. I say unreasonable because the disease itself, if it can sometimes become fatal, is considered serious, and if something is severe, it will necessarily appear as fear in some people. Because of the human mental state, the attitude, it is almost necessary to have a sense of fear, at least in today's age. However, the feeling of fear does nothing to help us not get sick. Moreover, it predisposes us to infectious disease, as Rudolf Steiner has repeatedly told us, GA 154, GA 261. So, by serving the media and passing on the knowledge of official bodies, the feeling of fear can be traced predominantly to Ahriman influence. How did they arouse fear? For example, by magic with numbers. They did not talk about the actual diseases, but about the infected ones, although not all infected people get sick. Moreover, just as a significant proportion of those infected with the flu will not become ill, a large proportion of those infected with the new disease will not become so. The other is that the number of infected people has been added up since the first infected person appeared, as if it were a realistic indication of the current situation. They did the same with the number of dead. Thus, they were able to report ever-increasing numbers to make the spread of the disease appear more significant at the moment. Although in the spring, for example, there were hardly any patients in Hungary compared to the current autumn-winter period. With such a small number of cases of influenza, it has not occurred at all to talk about an epidemic. When only a few infected people were found a day, there were still thousands of orders of magnitude to speak of as a result of the addition. Simpler-minded souls, who didn't always think about it, were deceived by this, because they might have thought that faithful but many are already sick, even though perhaps only 10 out of 10 million were found that day, plus an infected one who isn't even sure he got sick. In fact, Ahriman manipulated this communication, causing fear. Ahriman instilled a sense of fear into a person's being, his feelings. So when we are afraid, scared, anxious, shy, cowardly, in some form of fear, Ahriman is available in action. At the same time, it is not just Ahriman who can be in our interest to feel fear. Ahriman raises fears of disease, virus, and death. Especially in people with a materialistic feel, this endeavor is successful. He who is in fear is also under the increased control of Ahriman while feeling fear. Lucifer as a scarecrow. The feeling of fear is certainly an Ahrimani gift, but Lucifer can also arouse against the evil Ahrimani, which he hates. It was particularly interesting to note how vigorously Lucifer began to fight to keep the physical material facts based on science untrue. Nor was he deterred from the spreading all sorts of horror news through the right people. Lucifer is more able to thoroughly mislead and nourish the ghosts of the spiritually sensitive, and this is how it has happened now. After the onset of the disease, it was soon revealed in every country who had been the voice of Lucifer's impulse. While he was constantly accused of lying on official news, physical observations were called into question, and a campaign was conducted to deceive all the facts, while a selection of horror rumors were being spread. This succeeded in arousing fear in those in whom Ahriman failed to awaken fear of illness. Lucifer also served Ahriman. But from this he benefited even more, for with his campaign of denial and detour he could easily tear the masses of spiritual and approaching people out of the world of physical material facts. Some people with blue dung are still able to spread the horror news that PCR sampling sticks can infect people with the coronavirus. Of course, a lot is obviously possible. If I let go of my imagination, I could come up with a lot of asshole too. It is possible to kill people with a knife, drive people and run over people, and so on. There is no evidence that any of the sampling sticks caused infection. It is an idea received from the air, more precisely from Lucifer. Even with the horror of compulsory vaccination, many people have been driven into deep concern. As an anthroposophist, it is also inappropriate to instill fear of vaccination by spreading the unjustified horror, false news, and worries about it on the internet. They were also frightened by nanochip vaccination. This will be discussed in more detail later, and that children will be vaccinated by force. The fear of restricting freedom, the horror of dictatorship, also became part of the daily campaign. This also caused an unreasonable amount of fear and anxiety in people who are receptive to Luciferian influence. They began to paint a completely dystopian picture of a future under the control of Ahriman, in which everyone would be in complete control of the state, 24 hours a day, through technical means. Well, of course they have some seeds of truth, but in this form of deception. These will not happen recently. Everyone can rest easy. It is not ruled out that something like this will be introduced in one country of the world at a time, but it is unnecessary for us to worry about and upset in Hungary in 2020. It is not worth falling under the influence of such outbursts of anti-Ahriman by Lucifer. By the way, Lucifer is very adept at tearing people out of a certain part of reality, and at the same time in pursuing theories, opinions and explanations that are quite foreign to Lucifer. Some of these theories are commonly referred to as conspiracy theories. Lucifer causes epidemic blindness by taking care of the outbreak of the epidemic. As Ahriman tried to make the situation worse, more terrible than it really was, Lucifer was working to downplay the disease. Lucifer sought to exclude complicated deaths from COVID-19 disease. In doing so, Lucifer machined through the right people to declare the severity of the disease insignificant compared to the actual one. The purpose of Lucifer was to make people voice our insignificant little disease. Those who believed more in Lucifer gained more influence in them afterwards. Faced with deaths in November and December, quite a few people had to wake up from the thoughtlessness Lucifer had chased him into. It is true that only the deceased are approximately 6% had no other, underlying, disease besides COVID-19, which was also detected in Hungary. When the CDC, U.S. Health Authority, presented this in its statistics, people who had been made blind by Lucifer began to voice it with great pleasure that the CDC had changed its position so far. There aren't that many patients. There was no talk of a change of position here. They just made their statistics more accurate. The number of COVID-19 deaths has not decreased since then, according to the CDC. It is still there on their website, in black and white. It has only been established how many people have died from COVID-19 whose other illnesses have not been identified. But other patients also died from COVID-19, its complications, not from its underlying disease. In epidemic diseases, this is typically the case. Influenza also has a rate of around 6%. Infectious diseases amplify pre-existing diseases. Rudolf Steiner also spoke of this in GA 312. But most, about 94%, people die not because of their pre-existing diseases, but because of the infectious disease and its complications, which usually comes in combination with existing illnesses. If he hadn't contracted the infection, he would have usually lived for months or years, whether he had the flu or a coronary heart disease. In addition to the manipulative information provided by the authorities, a number of false reports appeared in the media, backed by impact-hunting websites, self-proclaimed confounders, telling people, journalists with sensationalist intentions. But the Russian disinformation machinery was also set in motion, which Lucifer intended primarily to trivialize the disease. This was inspired by Lucifer, but the part of the false news in Ahriman that increased or sustained the fear of death and illness. If lies and distortions, half-truths, partial truths were used to arouse doubts and fears about the new coronavirus disease, the existence of the virus, the goodness of testing, or the rigor of epidemiological measures, and even the development of vaccines, Lucifer was behind it. There has been a massive Lucifer campaign to keep people who can be deceived in this way completely out of physical reality. The materialists could not be greatly deceived by this campaign, as they are completely Ahrimani-influenced materialistic views of the world. Their thinking is dominated by Ahriman. On the other hand, those who are not materialists, or who have already embarked on the path of giving up materialism, have been very much ensnared by Lucifer with much of everything from pseudo-dumping. As part of this, they had to think of everything that was due to the observations of material science in connection with the virus, the disease, as nothing. Lucifer achieved this very easily for many. We know from Rudolf Steiner that vaccines did not appear today as evil beings, but because they prevent disease and premature death today, GA 120. But he later pointed out that Ahriman would also achieve the development of a vaccine that would severely degrade man's relationship with the spiritual world, GA 177. The quote about this has been very much picked up by those who are constantly looking for justification for their fear of vaccinations and who are driven by the desire to expose the machinations of evil materialist doctors and pharmaceutical companies who support and develop vaccines. Those who are spreading this quote from Rudolf Steiner today, who paints a dark future, are generating some kind of fear in people who are averse to vaccinations anyway, maybe even in those who have never lived in aversion. Of course, it is possible that it is not a big deal if many people are averse to vaccinations, but if this turns into a fanatical vaccination, it is again only due to Lucifer's influence over the human soul. Those who handed out the said Rudolf Steiner quote irresponsibly on the internet were generally not even anthroposophists. It is feared that this was also good for Lucifer so that many could form a one-sided view of Rudolf Steiner's position on vaccinations. Lucifer rejoiced at the distribution of this quote in a bad and good translation because it was able to further fuel the irrational denial of the scientific results associated with materialistic existence. Meanwhile, Ahriman rubbed his fist because it caused an unfounded fear among people who could not be chased with the disease and the deadly virus. Of course, the false news that vaccination against coronary heart disease will be mandatory in Hungary was also necessary for the latter. This was thrown into the public consciousness pretty soon, which is likely to be really mandatory in some countries. In Hungary, too, those who stubbornly planted the idea of the evil of vaccinations in their souls stubbornly clung to this idea. It is difficult for every soul to get rid of such unilateral opinion dumping of Luciferian origin, if it has been its spiritual nourishment for weeks or months. In Hungary, for example, it was already known weeks ago that vaccination would not be mandatory, yet many people were just bored with the possibility of the opposite. Again and again on Facebook, they just excited their friends with these thoughts. There was a mood, a terrible thing about the wrong things, a lot of lies. Again, behind this irresponsible behavior was only the rise of Luciferian influence. Let us see that Lucifer is constantly dealing with all sorts of theories, which, while possible, are not true, they are just fictions, they will not become a reality, or perhaps once, for a long time. One of the horrors is the nanochip vaccine coming soon. Not only Ahriman was the horror of the epidemic, but Lucifer as well. The latter has caused not only the horror of mandatory vaccination over and over again, but also the horror of nanochip vaccination. Some are teasing people that introducing it is already a realistic option. It is claimed that this is now technically feasible. No one doubts that. At most, they want to introduce this, and lately, and in secret. Those who consider the introduction of nanochip vaccine to be recent have also indicated that they have previously introduced dictatorial measures against the spread of the disease, which would not be permissible in rule of law. In the spring, David set in motion the theory that the epidemic was just an excuse to slowly bring everything under total control and bring about a dictatorship around the world by the world's backing forces. Otherwise, there are such background powers, but to apply to them the epidemic situation that has just developed is a complete setback. Interestingly, even today, many are able to believe in irrational, conspiracy, theories like this and the like. There are those who are also able to believe that those who have ordered epidemiological restrictions against an epidemic that they do not think can be convicted by citing them in court. It's weird to see how much they aren't bothered by an army of facts. For a few months now, it has been proven by many patients and deaths that this was not a bad decision to prevent. People are not forced to use ventilators. Incidentally, there were certain excesses in the hygiene provisions introduced during the epidemic, and I could list them, but it is basically clear from what is described in Part 4 of the series that these may be eligible measures at the time of an epidemic if they are not over-applied. By now, anyone who is sober-minded and adjusts to the real world can see that the disease could have been much more widespread in the spring, leading to the deaths of many more people if no restrictive measures had been taken. Of course, no one should believe that I like the provisions, the restrictions. I'm just saying they make sense, as Rudolf Steiner talked about it, GA 120. See sections 4.1 and 4/2, these can save lives. It is also worth considering whether it is not irresponsible to put others at risk, because we do not consider ourselves endangered because of this disease, if we infect them. Incidentally, the creation of the nanochip vaccine is suggested by Ahrimanic. Meanwhile, Lucifer is not idle either. He is trying to convince people through the rumors that he will be smuggled into the coronavirus vaccines that are currently being developed. Obviously this cannot be ruled out, but I see an extremely small chance of it, but it is excellent for creating horror. It is said that the horror of nanochip vaccination is not a conspiracy theory but a practice. However, it is still the future today, not the present. In fact, it will be confirmed in the near future that it is not. Or the facts will be refuted. Technology isn't really a theory, but the introduction still has a conspiracy-smelling theory. Many people think that there are evil people out there who have the fun or the main intention to experiment with people or to get people under their control by vaccination. This is why the nanochip will be smuggled into the vaccine. This is typically Lucifer's tale. He always wants to protect us from the applications of material, physical technology. He wants to remove him from physical reality. Let's not even believe anything that materialist science has to do with. If one falls to him, he also loses a healthy connection with the physical material half of reality. Because there have been people of all ages capable of similarly great evil, they are safe now, and in the right place, at the right time. Lucifer can convince many people today. Ahrimanic, of course, would almost edit a robot, a machine, from man, with a machine heart, with the help of a nanochip, to keep everyone under total control, even giving him eternal physical immortality. You want to implant all kinds of gadgets into a person's physical body so that you can really turn your spiritual life into such a way to make every talk about your soul and spirit crazy. However, there is currently no realistic prospect of this intention for COVID-19 vaccines, which are currently being licensed and developed. Later, nanochip vaccination will certainly be implemented. But that secretly smuggling it into vaccination is still the level of peasant blindness, the unproven theory. Nanochip vaccination can be considered a category of Luciferian fantasy, for the present and the near future. Those involved in approving vaccinations are not stupid either, they have a family, they have children, they are good-natured people. From a medical point of view, the vaccines that are about to be introduced are checked by professionals sworn to heal and serve life. With few exceptions, they are certainly not malicious, they do not want to be harmed by vaccinations. They do not want legal or illegal nanochip vaccination. Certainly not yet. There is no substantiated evidence that this is otherwise. So today I see the chances of introducing such a vaccine being extremely slim. But in a few years, it will be revealed whether he has thought about it in reality, who does not believe that such a vaccine will be introduced recently, or who already thinks that one of the current COVID-19 vaccines will have a nanochip. We'll be back in a few years on which vision is closer to reality. Restrictions on personal liberty. It is part of the overall picture that epidemiological regulations have restricted personal freedom quite significantly. A great many people have been unable to understand that in an epidemic, their own behavior also affects the health of other people. That is why there have been laws in several countries for decades that provide the legal basis for the measures needed at such times. You must not play with the death of people. Controlling the epidemic with external measures is also meaningless. As not everyone is able to understand the meaning and importance of protecting others, it was necessary to introduce certain restrictions, unpleasant rules in the year 2020 as well. For this reason, In a demagogic way, it is strange, to put it mildly, to treat every state leadership with a dictatorial token. This has nothing to do with dictatorship, but with the prevention of the death of certain people. It is clear that such measures will have to be taken in an increasingly democratic way in the future, but we do not seem to be here today. The idea of dictating the strictness of the law was thrown into the public domain by Lucifer. For him, the death of man does not matter much, for he acts in the sense of being elevated to a spiritual existence. He who dies at least ascends into the spirit world. He thinks this way, but not because of evil, but because of his extreme attitude toward human development. He was able to make many spiritually minded people dizzy. It was strange to see how people who are otherwise sentient-hearted, how incapable of appreciating the right to life of others, are only interested in their own external sham freedom. Even now, I do not understand how anyone can come to the idea, I know, of course, under the influence of Lucifer, of attacking and dictating the material provisions that can prevent the premature death of many people. Under the influence of Lucifer, man is able to stand so insensitive to the health of his companions. Testing. We've talked a little bit about testing. The detection and testing of an infection makes sense because the spread of the epidemic can be reduced by locating the symptomatic infected. If then the symptomatic infected take better care or restrict their movement so as not to pass on the possible infection to others. This can be done quite effectively with external hygiene. As testing is part of the materialistic treatment of the epidemic, its use and extension was most likely inspired by well-meaning angels left behind in ancient Egypt. There are also problems with testing. Not perfect? The bigger problem, however, is that testing can only detect an infection, not an infection-related disease. It is not the infection that matters, but rather whether the person who becomes infected becomes ill, that is, whether or not they develop physical symptoms. Asymptomatic infections are not contagious, at least if they are asymptomatic after a few days. On the other hand, those who are developing asymptomatic symptoms but do not yet have any physical signs, the virus has started to multiply in the body before the onset of physical symptoms, can already be infected at this stage by the amount of virus accumulated, virus shedding. A person whose body shows physical symptoms can become significantly infected. Anyone who develops physical symptoms or has more significant physical symptoms of the disease is less contagious. Those who remain asymptomatic should therefore be treated differently as they are not infected. However, as it is not possible to know during testing whether they will not have symptoms in a few days, it may be appropriate to include those who will not become ill after all. This seems correct as a precaution. It is a question of whether it is right to be so careful. Today, it has been proven that infected asymptomatic cases occur mainly in children without the development of disease. Children, therefore, pose a much lower risk of dissemination, especially small ones, than the benefits of restricting them. After all, very few of them become contagious and sick. In primary schools and kindergartens, at least among children, I do not see much point in restrictive measures. This is more about the physical and mental oppression of the children behind Ahriman. Infection with COVID-19 becomes apparent to an outside observer, and here I mean mainly health professionals being able to detect the presence of a virus in the body that is involved in the physical spread of the disease. Because a person who does not have the virus to multiply in the physical body never shows physical symptoms of the disease, the presence of the virus has now become a condition for being declared infected. However, this is not correct because asymptomatic infected people are not infected and should not be registered as infected. This greatly falsifies infection rates worldwide. Behind this is Ahriman. But Lucifer is not idle either. In this area, too, he ran a massive confusing campaign to expel materialist scientific methods and procedures. The purpose of this was to snatch as many people out of physical reality as possible and disregard as well. This has been achieved predominantly among those with other thoughts: no virus, no disease, no need for precautions, vaccinations are dangerous, they are worthless. Bill Gates is weaving plans to eradicate the population with vaccinations, want to introduce an epidemic worldwide. Under the pretext of the epidemic they want to take our freedom, etc., could have significantly influenced him. Some people are talking about a testing epidemic. They say there are so many patients in hospitals and intensive care units today because they test a lot. This is an obvious lie. No one will be sick from being tested, declared at most falsely infected, or falsely uninfected. Henceforth, they will not enter hundreds of hospitals and intensive care units. Even the measurement results of the PCR tests considered to be the most reliable had to be questioned by those who came under such strong influence from Lucifer. For this, a discarded sentence from Kary Mullis, the inventor of the PCR test, was also snatched. Based on this, it has been argued throughout that the test is not suitable for detecting infection at the time of an epidemic. They forgot, but Lucifer did not intend to take this into account, that science has evolved a lot since Mullis invented this test and later expressed this view. Today, the technology of science is more advanced than when Mullis was actively working, so he did not know well that science has since been able to create fairly reliable PCR tests that can be widely and effectively deployed even during epidemics. The PCR testing procedure was soon completed for the new coronavirus and appears to be used by professionals with 95% confidence, sensitivity plus specificity. This is a relatively good rate if it really is. But many people have already been misdiagnosed as infected, false positive, and many have not been misdiagnosed as positive, false negative. A recent court ruling in Portugal has also condemned the practice of PCR testing on the grounds that non-infectious people are sometimes misled due to a testing error, which causes inconvenience and even limits their freedom from positive action. However, the court also ruled that a positive test result in Portugal is not in itself a patient and does not constitute a medical diagnosis. It is a matter of point of view. It is an acceptable verdict, but it must also be seen that if no examination were carried out, many coronary artery patients would still be in hospital and die of the disease. In an epidemic, the number of patients in an emergency can unfold to such an extent that it is not always possible to wait for a medical diagnosis if there is no capacity for it. So there are problems with testing. The reliability of testing can also be easily compromised by, for example, incorrect sampling, improper handling of samples, and the use of too few but especially too many cycles. It is not yet known exactly what percentage of tests in each country were performed poorly and how many people were declared false positive or false negative because of this. There is too much fuss around testing. They talk too much about this, attach too much importance to whether someone is infected, even though what matters is whether someone is infected, not just whether they are infected, even if the test results are real. Behind the emphasis on testing is presumably Ahriman's machinations alone. Numbers. We also need to talk about numbers. Rudolf Steiner, GA 191, talked about how Ahriman likes to play with numbers and is actually easy to justify the unreal things in life in a sense that serves Ahriman's evil interests. By the way, Lucifer also likes to keep a person at the level of abstracts with the help of numbers in mathematics, so that he does not get into material reality or remove him from physical perceptible reality. He does this a little differently than Ahriman does, and the rising numbers were reported daily in official briefings, and a distinctly Ahriman effect could be seen. It is no coincidence that this has significantly increased fear in many. The number of the dead is also an interesting topic. In some people, fear also activated Lucifer, and they began to lie about the growing number of people who died in COVID-19 to deceive themselves, deep in their souls, into their fears of illness and death. For them, the doubt about the current number of dead was due to Lucifer's frightening influence. However, there have been cases where the dead have been counted in a proven wrong way among the dead COVID-19, which then poured oil on the Lucifer embers. These few cases upset the nerves so much that they then weighed much more heavily in the spiritual world of the people ruled by Lucifer than would have been justified. As a result of this one-sidedness, many people believed very quickly, under Luciferian influence, that they were deliberately falsifying statistics. Even in the spring, slippages became widespread, with hospitals in some countries deliberately classifying deaths as COVID-19 victims who were not. False news is that they do this because they get paid for all such misclassifications. Of course, this is not true. Hospitals get funding after patients, that's all. But this has been the case so far. It was also possible to create an enormous lie from this. The Luciferian idea of falsifying death numbers has reached quite astonishing proportions in the souls of many. They had to believe they wanted to set the death toll for COVID-19 directly higher so that governments everywhere could introduce a dictatorship. The epidemic, they say, is just an excuse for that. Initially, they were also able to claim that there were no dead victims of the disease. Many people still believe this today, when there have never been so many people on a ventilator in Hungary at one time. But if they don't believe it anymore, they will still try to annihilate deaths through government action, improper treatment, fear of death, or other external areas that also affect Ahriman's jurisdiction, for example, electricity, 5G, flu vaccinations. In part, there is truth in these as well, but it does not explain the many sick and dead. According to their conspiracy theory, the goal is to gradually bring the population under greater control, take away the freedom they have gained so far, and introduce a dictatorship. Needless to say, irrationalism, alienated from such a reality, is very wild. When they passed on the false news they heard, or the reality they distorted themselves. Later, when many were dead, most could no longer hold this position. Even under strong pressure from Lucifer, no longer denied that they could be the fatalities of this disease, but very little could be considered real. So few have had to keep the official statistics about this completely false because of numbers that do not match their ideas. Many still deceive themselves with far fewer fatalities in a coronary epidemic. According to official data, approximately they take 1 to 6% of it. Citing that those who had other illnesses certainly died not from the coronary epidemic but from their underlying illness. We cannot say that these statistics are not flawed, even in several ways and on several occasions but it is good for everyone to know that infectious diseases are characterized by the fact that they exacerbate other diseases and have complications. Therefore, the official mortality figure is broadly correct. 99 to 94% of the dead above 1 to 6% presumably die from the coronary epidemic with very high accuracy because they also had an underlying disease, but if they had not been infected, the majority would still be living with their underlying disease. Let's not believe Lucifer has deviated from reality in his math. Lucifer tears me out of the world of physical facts. It was extremely painful to see how many people could be so singled out from the physical reality on earth that he was unable to think of anything other than that they were deliberately cheating on the incidence and number of coronary heart disease in every country. At Lucifer's suggestions, they had to think that even if the disease was dead, it could be very little, by no means as much as what was reported in the news. They were also pleased when the news about the 6% figure came out. It was just misinterpreted. I could just cool off when I saw how many got into the camp of the misguided. According to them, the population is being manipulated in a coordinated and significantly falsified way in all countries. Quite a little sober thinking is enough to see how real this is. I also wrote an article about Swedish deaths over the summer, See Section 3, to fix this a bit. Manipulation of statistics is an existing thing, but corpses are not falsified to such an extent and in a coordinated manner at the same time. This is a typical case of impossibility or conspiracy theory. At the national level, in some countries it might even be feasible, but globally, in a coordinated way, at the same time, this could be a model for the impossible. So much could Lucifer take away the common sense of those who were in any way inclined to what he had induced them to do, ignore what is being communicated from, or in support of, materialist science. Thus, in 2020, many people became viral, dead blind, epidemic blind. Few deny the epidemic now, even in early December 2020, when hospitals, and especially their intensive care units, are hardly able to cure and treat COVID-19 patients. However, epidemic blindness is a rather stubborn condition. Those whose thinking comes under such significant Lucifer control will find it very difficult to believe anything from the physical reality that would tip them out of their particular Lucifer dream world, in which they fantasize that COVID-19 is scarce and dead, and if it is not. From it, etc. The question arises as to whether one who is so overwhelmed by common sense can freely form an idea at all, at least in relation to illness. He may have believed in the existence of viruses before, but now, as a result of Lucifer's campaign to downplay the virus and cause epidemic blindness, he doesn't know if he can really believe in them. In any case, the existence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19 disease, is surprised by many. Roughly this perception has emerged: are there a lot of serious COVID-19 patients in hospitals? Already a lot of dead every day? Come on. He's not doing anything. We refuse. Anyone who can no longer connect to the physical side of reality with common sense is in line with the slogans of the Lucifer campaign. Statistics lie, the virus is not isolated, the hospital rooms are empty, there are hardly any dead, most of the dead did not die from the disease at all but because they have been misled, or because of the fear which is aroused in them, and so on. Fear certainly has a role to play in this, but it is not that great. Those in epidemic blindness even say this when all people with common sense are aware that the disease, the epidemic does exist, and that there are more dead and hospitalized people in proportion to the rate of the disease than the flu. We cannot say that in some cases the mistreatment, inadequate medical care, or in several cases the fear could not have led to illness, etc., or possibly death. These are also real factors. Rudolf Steiner also talks about how fear can lead to catching an infectious disease, but attributing the majority of cases to any of these listed is a thought that has already lost ground. Thinking is so narrow if one neglects to maintain a balance, to form a sober, objective judgment. Obviously, medical treatment and care can also lead to wrong decisions about the new disease. The number of corpses may therefore be higher. The number of deaths from other diseases may also increase because many elderly or sick people do not dare to go to the doctor during such an epidemic, intimidated period. Or you don't even have a chance. Yet fear and the number of deaths from other illnesses account for much of the excess death, but what Lucifer does not allow those under his influence to admit is that the new coronary disease does exist, causing far more deaths and near deaths than influenza. So there is a hint of uncertainty in almost all official information, a minor flaw, which is why those whose thinking Lucifer determines on this issue discard everything that is the official, materially well-founded medical position. They prefer to listen to Godney, Thomas, and some doctors and laypeople who can barely rely on medical studies, rather than all the other doctors whose work is already supported by numerous scientific studies. It is no coincidence that they are in the overwhelming majority. From this, it is quite obvious that there is a new coronary heart disease that causes more people to die than one flu and that more patients need hospital care, even though there are fewer patients than in a major flu epidemic. This is supported by the physical facts in Hungary. While Lucifer wants to tear himself away from material existence by denying the existence of the virus, trivializing the disease, lying the facts controlled by many in scientific research, Ahriman, in addition to fearing fear, seeks to tear man away from further spiritual development by using material means. It is in line with this intention that, today, external technological development is slowly leading to inventions that, if used with very bad intentions, can cause serious harm to humanity, hampering our development. This may even include nanochip vaccination, which is now technically feasible. It can be said that today's medicine is usually on a materialistic basis, which Lucifer hates very much. He believes in spiritual healings, that there's a spiritual cause for everything. It encourages faith in our own self-healing powers. It appeals to feelings, to the spiritual. This would not even be a problem because it plays an important role in many diseases and healing. However, as a one-sided, Luciferian position, it is already misleading. And official medicine is primarily aided by Ahriman means. Detection of viruses is also possible only with an electron microscope. PCR testing also requires equipment and compounds that can be considered Ahrimanic. But all this does not prove that everything that can be known for sure must be discarded in a Luciferic way, not on a theoretical basis through the use of materialistic tools and equipment. Lucifer wants to remove it from physical reality. You want as many people as possible to ignore the physical material facts. What is particularly frustrating in this situation is that it has succeeded in bringing to such enormous errors those who are close to spiritual development or are already on the spiritual path. It was precisely those who were best guided, the proponents of the biggest lies, who shouted the most lies about official information and everything that came from the results of materialistic, scientific research. By now, it is quite clear that there were many small lies and a lot of manipulation in the official information, and even errors in the statistics. In comparison, the mistakes, lies, and misrepresentations made under Lucifer's influence, and still voiced today, are enormous. No virus? Turns out it is. No disease? But there is. Isn't the disease serious? But it has been completely proven to be more severe than the course of the flu in more people. No epidemic? So where did these many sick and dead people come from? If it is not epidemic, how can it be spread by infection? Are they cheating directly on the number of dead in every country? Why this is the culmination of incapable fantasy does not need to be explained to sober thinkers. The interesting thing is that while the camp of those under pressure in Lucifer has constantly lied to those who take the official position, there are many more and more lies associated with their fierce activities. During this epidemic, it was not Ahriman who was the big liar, but Lucifer. It was not the materialists who lied to the greatest, but rather those who professed a spiritual view. Ahriman couldn't really persuade people to lie big, only small ones. Lucifer all the more so. Ahriman has aroused fear in his machinations in many more people, a fact, but Lucifer has tickled Ahriman far beyond the extent of his lies. Moreover, he tried to spread rumors about alleged lies, vaccinations, etc., causing fear in the spiritual minds as well. For example, he said that the COVID-19 vaccination would be mandatory in Hungary as well. There will be a country where it really will be, but not exactly with us. He also said that there will be a nanochip vaccine that will know what harm they will be able to do to us. But who? They don't know that either. But obviously Bill Gates will have something to do with it, since he is already the incarnate devil in the minds of many people. The purpose of the whole thing is to put the population under complete control and surveillance and to ruin our jobs and our lives. The lies of 2020 were preparations for a future epidemic. In this way, it has succeeded in arousing considerable fear in many people, especially Ahriman, and in bombarding and ensnaring a small section of the population worldwide, especially Lucifer, with huge lies. Ahriman so feared more people than Lucifer could lead. Rudolf Steiner has spoken about it several times, so I think that lies have a greater role to play in the development of future epidemics than fear. Thus, it can be concluded that the people plunged into unrealistic thinking and explanations by Lucifer during 2020, as well as those chased into fear by minor lies by Ahriman, gave the counterforces enough ammunition to make the future a flood of lies into the world. Flooded with an atmosphere of fear, a new epidemic disease should be prepared. Every lie is an explosion in the astral world. There have been plenty of huge explosions among those under the influence of Lucifer this year in connection with coronary heart disease, and even more under the influence of Ahriman. Is it possible to contribute more actively to the emergence of another pandemic in an environment full of fear? In Hungary, the situation is compounded by the fact that COVID-19 infected people are considered COVID-19 dead even if they have recovered from them and died of other causes. But this is unlikely to have contributed significantly to the untruthfulness of the numbers. If, on the other hand, this rule is maintained, it will distort the statistics much more over time than before. December 12, 2020